Welcome to the Curriculum, Kommune's content platform focused on showcasing the design ethos and process behind emerging fashion designers. Today, we're going to enter the world of Professor.E and break the brand down and tell their story from their beginnings, design language, and then ultimately the clothing. Through this process, we want to help you understand why we think Professor.E is a fascinating brand, and our journey today starts during the age of discovery. Professor.E has this amazing lore based around its brand. And this is because Professor.E is actually an imaginary character based during the Age of Discovery. This was a period between the 1400s and the 1600s where seafaring Europeans sailed around the world looking to explore and colonize new places. They were fueled by wealth, power, and this curiosity that came from the Renaissance. We have explorers like Christopher Columbus and John Cabot, who set sail around the world looking for these new territories. At the same time, we have the emergence of Baroque art. This form of art was characterized by its direct, obvious, and dramatic compositions, which were led by artists like Diego Velázquez and Caravaggio. Here's a quote from Ken Rao, one of the members of the team who described what this period means for the brand. Ken says, quote, "The team was given an imaginative boundary to examine and explore the culture of the period. From the Baroque and Rococo styles of painting to architecture, the scientific discoveries of astronomy and geography, as well as reflecting on the colonial conflicts and the exotic fantasies of mainstream Western vision." From the start, we have something incredible happening with Professor.E. By creating this imaginary character and setting this character during the Age of Discovery, Professor.E has made it very clear that storytelling is key to their brand. Having a story that goes along the brand adds this additional dimension, and as we'll talk about during the video, this is only the beginning. Before we get into that though, I first want to talk about some history of Professor.E. Because Professor.E started out as the Relab project, something that Ken Rao was also a part of. And this project became really popular because of the JCKA jacket, a jacket that was made by dismantling then reconstructing a Japanese kendo fabric and a Chinese Tang suit. Now Professor.E is made up of a virtually fully anonymous team that designs under this vision, under this identity of Professor.E. It's this collective effort that Ken Rao calls decentralization. And here we see another fresh take on an industry standard, because not having an individual creative head this brand allows this brand to really focus in on what matters more to them. And in this case, it appears to be the clothing, the narrative, and the history that the brand is trying to talk about. Diving into their design language, the most prominent motif from Professor.E is definitely their face coverings. These face coverings can be seen in their product shots, their editorials, their lookbooks, basically all the photography that the brand does. The most interesting about these masks though is the fact that they change from season to season depending on the narrative or the theme of the collection. These face coverings are often embellished in striking ways, with the use of printed fabrics and even jewelry making an appearance. And these face coverings are key to their universe and world building. But Professor.E weren't the first one to do this. Face coverings were very much pioneered by Margiela, and then worn by this guy. But Professor.E seems to find most of their inspiration in Undercover's Autumn-Winter 2006 collection. This collection, dubbed Guru Guru, features tonal face masks on models that are wearing clothes of the same color. Here, Jun Takahashi is trying to emphasize the idea of female facial beauty by taking it away. Professor.E has taken that and made it their own. Because by using different face masks season to season, these face masks have become a part of their story building every single collection. Here's a comparison between Professor.E's face coverings from Autumn-Winter 2017 to Autumn-Winter 2022. As you can see, they've become a lot more sophisticated. Not only have they become more sophisticated, but these face coverings have become key to pushing the narrative every single collection. One example of this is Spring/Summer 19 dubbed Libertas, where Professor.E uses this helmet-like face covering that sort of references the Spartans. Another example is Spring/Summer 20, where the use of turban-like headwear and this black wide sun hat fits into their collection surrounding the desert. Spring/Summer 20 is really interesting to me because of this element of Orientalism that's in the collection. Orientalism was a period that followed the Age of Discovery that was a representation of Asia, especially the Middle East, that embodied these colonial attitudes. When we look at the archive section of the Professor.E website, we see a lot of the referential images that Professor.E used to create the face coverings for this season. One referential image is a painting by a French artist named Jean Dunois. This painting, called The Sentinel, is a clear reference image to the way they created their pink turban-like headpiece for this season. Dunois was known to be an Orientalist painter. He traveled to Cairo during his time and painted many genre paintings. We see this element of Orientalism again when we look at the reference image that inspired the black wide sun hat. Although I couldn't find the source file, in this photo we see a person being photographed wearing a black wide brimmed sun hat, a clear reference to the one that Professor.E made. However, there's still this element of Orientalism, as there's this Western-centric shot that's clearly exotic to them. One more image I want to show you is a picture of a horse and dove that's used in their Spring/Summer 20 archive. Although this picture doesn't seem to be directly referenced in Spring/Summer 20, it comes back as a lookbook shot in their Fall/Winter 20 collection in this absolutely fantastic shot. Overall, Professor.E uses face coverings as a way to further their narrative and story within their collection. Historically, it could be a reference to Baroque masquerade masks, but Professor.E really pushes it a rung forward. Especially in Spring/Summer 20, Professor.E uses their face coverings to communicate and comment on the way history has been interpreted, which is often through this Western-centric lens. Because what Professor.E does is they take referential imagery and take that to create their collection. And that's not very different from the way Jean Dunois created his painting of the Sentinel. He traveled from his homeland to a different place to look into a different culture, experience it, and create paintings surrounding it. Professor.E is thus drawing parallels between the way they create collections and the way art has been created in the past. It's this common theme that follows the era of the Great Discovery that Professor.E is commenting on here, which is essentially commenting on the way that history itself is interpreted, which, in my opinion, is incredibly meta and interesting. Overall, the use of face coverings, especially by shifting them from season to season, really pushes the narrative and storytelling aspects of Professor.E's brand. Yet, by removing the face, they're essentially saying that this history has no identity, which means it's essentially open for interpretation, which is where the wearer fits in. It's where the person that's wearing the clothes can slot in and interpret the clothes and the narrative around it for themselves. These little details are key to the design language of Professor.E. And as you'll continue to see, it happens at every single touch point the customers have with Professor.E as a brand. Every time you receive a package from Professor.E, it's like you receive a package from Professor.E, the character themselves. The receipt comes in a string-tied bag, which is incredibly tactile. Here's a receipt that I've kept, which is handwritten on this watermarked paper with the presence of a map. The map here is a reference to the idea of exploration, and we see that the header says, "Where does mythology end and where does history start?" This feels like a commentary on the idea of preconceived notions, especially when it came to the way that travelers told stories about the places they traveled to when they reached their home country. Here, Professor.E is commenting on the spread of those stories, and how, in some cases, these stories eventually become history, especially when they're being spread by the winners of conflict within history. Once again, this element of storytelling is evident even in their packaging, which adds an additional dimension for the customer to appreciate. It's incredibly subtle and the details are intricate, but they add to the brand's design language and overall ethos. Finally, getting into the clothes, to really boil it down, Professor.E is a brand that has incredible attention to detail with this artisanal feeling to every single piece of clothing. The brand can be characterized by unique silhouettes, incredible fabrics, and intricate seasonal prints. And it's the type of clothing that doesn't bring immediate attention to its wearer, but upon closer inspection, there's a wealth of details present in every single piece. To show that, let's talk about a few looks. The first look is from Spring 22 from their men's collection. This look features a model in a maroon tunic top, a black blazer, and black trousers. not to mention the beautiful gold embellished face covering. The blazer and the pants are a real standout for me. We see patches of fabric, varied buttons of different sizes, colors, and materials that creates this collage of buttons. This collage is reminiscent of homemade adjustments that people make to clothes when they're handing something down to their younger sibling. Once again, there's this element of history that Professor E is employing within their design language. But instead of using this big historical narrative, they've really boiled it down to the granular into family history. This blazer is a perfect example of that, where the blazer is passed down from family member to family member with new buttons sewed on to fit the new wearer. These are the little details that Professor E does so incredibly well, continuously cementing that idea of history into their design language. Moving on to the fabric, the blazer uses a patch style construction with 3 different fabrics that's detailed with a velvet webbing. Here, I gotta come back to the idea that Professor E makes clothing that when seen from afar just sort of looks relaxed and subtle, but then you come close and you look at the fabrics on this blazer, these 3 different fabrics that create these intricate shapes, the webbing that adds the contouring onto the blazer itself, and then the patch fabric construction that creates these different shades and shapes on the garment itself. The last thing I want to talk about is the inner lining, and no surprises here, the inner lining also changes from season to season. For Spring/Summer 22, Professor E uses a print of watercolor drawings of flowers, a reference to the way early explorers may have drawn different organisms on their leather-bound notebooks. Another look I'm going to talk about is also from Spring 22, but this time from their women's collection. This look features a beautiful wool long coat, a maxi skirt, and a black tunic. The star here is once again the outerwear, where we see this intricate patterned coat with these root-like lines. The lines are complemented with ruching details, which Professor E calls blend toggle, which creates these intricate shapes on the garment while the uniqueness of the fabric takes the stage. Once again, we're going to take a look at their inner lining. Here we see a drawing of a Corinthian column, a geometric study of that same column, and then the column existing with a bunch of flowers. To me, the inner lining is a conversation between man-made and nature, and what happens when the two interact. The geometric study is what happens when people design man-made objects, the same way that the clothing itself was designed by the Professor E team. The drawing of the Corinthian column itself is almost like a product shot for a piece of clothing, where the man-made object is just being watched and seen and observed. But when we move to the bottom image, we see that the Corinthian column now exists next to a bed of flowers. The same way that the wearer of the jacket, when worn outside, is allowing the piece of clothing to interact with the outside world, to interact with nature. This parallel between the imagery on the inner lining and the jacket and the way that they interact together is unbelievable. The jacket is representative of the inner lining, yet the inner lining is also representative of the jacket. So what we see with Professor E clothing is that the team continues to use referential imagery while enticing the customer to look for these little details and interpret the clothing for themselves. Professor E employs universal narratives such as history, but leaves these small, minute details in their packaging, in their clothing, in their editorial for the curious customer to find. And the best part about it is that this customer can interpret it for themselves. Is that not what history is? The idea that every single person has a different interpretation of the events that happen. We use our own personal experiences, what we see, what we hear, what we feel, and ultimately make a judgment on what's happening. And that's exactly what is happening with Professor E. When you put on something from Professor E, you're inheriting the context that they've given you. But the experience and the history that you have with this item will be your very own. And that's the best part and the most incredible thing about Professor E's brand. Thank you so much if you made it to the end. I know that it's fabric and stitches to a lot of people, but here at Komune, we're trying to find and break down the stories of brands that we find conceptually fascinating and aesthetically beautiful. Subscribe for more, like if you enjoyed, and follow us in the description to learn more about Komune as a project. My name is Martin. This has been an episode of the Curriculum on Professor E. From us to you, please take care.